My name is Ross, and I'm a bit of a nerd for all things nature, so I created this project as a means of sharing fun facts, observations, deep thoughts, and philosophy on the world that we all share, aptly titled, well, Nerdy About Nature. I aim to create a more diverse, inclusive, equitable, and just future for all of us by breaking down barriers to access factual, science-based education while providing critical insight and constructive conversation on environmental and social issues to encourage positive changes in this world that we all share. The way I see it, the more people know about and understand our world, then the more fun they're able to have when they're getting out amongst it, to build connection and relationship to it, to fall in love with it, and thus be inclined to act in ways that protect it well into the future. Because nature sure is pretty neat, and I think we should keep it that way.
Welcome to the Abodo CPD webinar series. It's great to have you with us. My name is DK and I'm your host / MC for today's learning experience. You're very welcome here. And today's theme is about protecting the forest we can't replace. And as you've already been introduced to Ross there, I'll give him a proper introduction. He's going to take us on a wild and wonderful journey through his experience, and you're going to learn a lot. We're going to be followed up with that with a Q&A moderated session by Daniel Gudsell, who's the founding director of Abodo, who brings you the CPD webinar series. You're joined about 800 other signatories today, all joining us from around the world, who are like-minded construction professionals, architects, designers who are interested in stored carbon, wood, circularity, sustainability, anything about protecting our fair land and doing the jobs whilst doing your jobs. So it's great to have you with us. I've got a couple of housekeeping things to go through to get out of the way before we get into the content. So let's do that right now. So we're using a platform called Livestorm to do this webinar series on. It has a chat functionality on the right-hand side and a questions tab. Just for your brain, there's no live Q&A in a sense today because that's taken over by a pre-collated questions that we had with Daniel Gudsell. But feel free in the chat room to share where you're coming to us from live today, who you're representing, what you're into. You can collate in the chat function as well any quotes, any resources you'll find. Over there in the chat, you'll find Jay. Jay will be looking after you, and if there's any technical difficulties, you'll see her email on this slide, so hit her up. We have found that Livestorm is very stable on Chrome and Firefox, but if you're using a different browser and it's working for you, just carry on using that browser. But if it is a little bit janky and if it is stalling a little bit, like I say, Chrome and Firefox. Jay as well will also help you out with any Abodo related questions that you have, so please hit her up for any content that you need, any follow-ups and any meetings you have in that space. As I mentioned, our theme is protecting the forest we can't replace. Old growth ancient forests, as you know, are ecosystems that are centuries in the making. And this constructive conversation that's going to follow now will help you think a little bit differently, hopefully better, about the architectural decisions that you're making to protect what's irreplaceable. That's our main focus today. The last couple of pieces of housekeeping is basically this is a CPD experience, so that means continuing professional development, and it's accredited via Tulo. Tulo's our accreditation platform, partner here today. They do a lot of, they're a provider of architecture, design and technology related educational content direct to you. And because of that, this is globally accredited and you'll be emailed a certificate after the event. So you don't have to worry too much. It's going to come live into your inbox as well. So hopefully that'll take a little bit of lifting out for you. And the last thing to say, as I mentioned, 800 people signed up for this seminar. So please, in the chat, let us know who you are, where you come into us live from. Globally, it's always great to hear from you. And hopefully you'll have your notebooks to hand, your favorite beverage, so we can get into this session today. So let me give you a proper introduction to Ross, who you've already been introduced to very sparsely there in our opening trailer. Ross is going to take us on a presentation, and again followed by Daniel. So Ross first. Ross Reid, Managing manages a social, ecological educational project called Nerdy About Nature, which began as a way of documenting and sharing observations and fun facts about the natural world. Blending the perception of a naturalist with philosophy and humor, he aims to make your next venture into the outdoors more enjoyable. He strongly believes that more people who know and understand the world around us, the more fun they'll have out enjoying it, that they too can fall in love with it, and we can all work together, creating a better world for future generations. Nerdy About Nature aims to create a more diverse, inclusive, equitable, and just future for us all by breaking down these barriers to access and by providing critical insight and constructive conversation on environmental and social issues to encourage positive changes in this world we all share. As I mentioned after Ross's presentation, he's going to be joined by Daniel Gudsell for a Q&A. Daniel Gudsell is the founding director of the New Zealand-based and family-owned company Abodo Wood. In an industry where many exterior timbers are harvested from unsustainable old-growth forests, for over 20 years, Daniel has led a movement towards a more sustainable, innovative approach, crafting featured timbers that are beautiful, high-performing, and protect forests that are irreplaceable. As a member of the International Research Group of Wood Preservation, Daniel relates to the world's greatest minds in wood technology and has led much of the company's new market development and product design. So he'll be joining Ross after his presentation. So Ross, the digital stage for this Abodo CPD webinar series is all yours.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the introduction. Happy to be here with everybody today. Thanks for joining me. I am currently up in North America, so a bit of a time difference. But yeah, as kind of mentioned, Nerdy About Nature is a passion project that aims to educate people through inspiring, fun conversations. So I'm hoping we can try to have that here, even though it's going to be a lot of me talking to you guys. I'm going to try to keep it really high level here, going into some details on some sciencey stuff, but it's going to be a fun learning experience. So bear with me and let's drop into it here. So again, my name is Ross. Nerdy About Nature is my kind of passion project thing that I'm running these days. And I was born and raised in Washington State, United States, and I currently live up in British Columbia, Canada, in the Cascadian bioregion. For those of you who are unfamiliar with that, this is a kind of map here of North America, or Turtle Island. So we've got Washington State about here, British Columbia, and all of this is the Cascadian bioregion. Now, a bioregion is an area of land that's united by common waterways, hydrology, climate, and species diversity. And this part of the world in particular is known for its magnificent ancient temperate rainforests, which are full of some of the largest trees in the entire world. Now, the health of this bioregion, as any bioregion, depends on internal factors, things that happen within this region, as well as external factors, things happening from outside of it, specifically here in the kind of the Pacific Ocean. And wherever you are on this planet, like down in New Zealand, in the UK, anywhere around the world, you are in a bioregion that is dependent on many things. So to get a better understanding of the importance of bioregions, we're just going to zoom out for a hot second here. Because this world that we all live in, that we all share on, and that we all live on and share, is made up of many different bioregions, large and small, and these bioregions ignore international boundaries, these arbitrary lines on the map that us humans create. You know, we are all part of this earth. We all share this earth together, regardless of where we're from. And I feel that it's our responsibility, our collective responsibility, to act in ways that take care of it and preserve it into the future for future generations, whether that's in our own backyard or on the other side of the planet. Because our planet is a pretty spectacular place, and this moment in time is a pretty unique one. And so we're going to get a little bit nerdy here, and we're going to go back into deep time to kind of understand how exactly we ended up where we are today. Because our Earth has been changing for a very, very, very long time. The early atmosphere on Earth was really rich in CO2 with very little oxygen. And the planet, as a result, was much hotter, between 8 to 15 to 20 degrees hotter than it is today. And in the early days of Earth, there was absolutely nothing on land. If you can imagine that, it was all just bare rock. rain fell and just quickly washed into the sea. There were no soils. There was nothing growing. It was just literally a barren, rocky landscape. And early life evolved in shallow seas, which we can kind of see here in this map of the tectonic plates moving about 4 billion years ago. And this early life was early photosynthesizing algae in these shallow seas that created the first oxidation event, the Great Oxidation Event, which released so much oxygen into the atmosphere, it actually created a global cooling event, because things warm and cool naturally over millions and millions of years here on Earth. And life kind of lived there for quite a long time, a few billion years. And it wasn't until 470 million years ago, the planet had warmed up again significantly. And early life began to migrate to land. Now, early on, this was non-vascular plants like mosses, like we have here, this little polytrichum moss, and different algae that were kind of the first species to make it to land, which eventually evolved into the first trees like Archaeopteris here, which is the first thing that we consider to be a tree. And this was a radical shift on the planet because this is the first time that soils were able to be created. So you had erosional forces, chemical forces, the fungi and mosses starting breaking down rock. Then you had biotic forces that were leaving, organic matter to create the first soil. And all of that radically changed things. It slowed rivers down. It created, different geological formations, sedimentary rock, all sorts of things began to form because of this life kind of coming onto land at this time. And then about 300 million years ago, we have the Carboniferous period, which I have a lovely illustration of here, which is the first big boom of plant life. It sucked so much CO2 out of the air. It stored a ton of carbon. It's actually the biggest store of carbon that we still have on the planet. This period in Earth's history is where all of our coal comes from, hence the name, the Carboniferous period. So plants have a really important role in regulating our atmosphere, the Earth's atmosphere, over very long periods of time. They release carbon, like when they decompose and when they're stored up, it holds that carbon in, it drops the planet down to a manageable temperature. And right now, we're currently releasing all of the carbon that was stored during the Carboniferous period when we burn fossil fuels such as coal. And these create changes that are happening now on 100-year scales, decade-long scales even, versus the millions of years that our planet has kind of evolved to withstand. And life on this planet has evolved to be accustomed to. But flashing back to Cascadia, recent history, about 20,000 years ago, the area where I'm sitting right now was covered in about 2 kilometers of glaciers. And those glaciers slowly began to retreat as we entered the Eocene era that we're in right now, to about 10,000 years ago when this land was finally ice-free. But right at the beginning of this, it was very inhospitable. It looked a lot different than it does today. There would have been a really rocky habitat, kind of like what we see up in Alaska and even Sweden, where glaciers are retreating. And it would have taken pioneer species like fungi to break down those rocks and minerals, followed by mosses, pioneering plant species like alders, which come in and kind of form the first organic matter soil that's rich in nitrogen. And with that rich nitrogen, it allows for other conifer trees like red cedar, spruce, hemlock, firs, and pines to all kind of move up from the south to develop and grow, creating a really complex forest ecosystem. So these soils formed the first real river ecosystems that we have in this part of the world. It slowed water, it collected debris, it held soil, and it reduced erosion. So these trees with their big root systems will hold the soil banks together and ends up creating a really deep, narrow, and meandering channel with cool waters that creates all sorts of amazing habitat for insects, as well as aquatic things that live in these ecosystems, such as salmon that bring nutrients up from the ocean. And then the forest houses all the bears and martens and all these different animals as these ecosystems kind of develop in a very intricate, interconnected way where different species depend on one another. In these ecosystems here, these complex forests, every single piece of it is important. Everything plays a role. And of course, ever since these trees, these salmon, these bears, everything kind of moved into these ecosystems as they evolved, humans were also a part of this. Humans have been part of this landscape since time immemorial. I know it's difficult for many of us in our modern kind of worlds to reckon with this fact, but humans are a bunch of wild animals, and we always have been active parts of our ecosystems, not apart from them. So some of these relationships in these complex forest ecosystems, just to talk about them here, you have big old growth trees like this Western red cedar here, which slow water runoff.
They, the roots hold soils together. They make rivers less prone to drought and flashy floods and rain events. They hold the riverbanks together, creating those narrow channels which filter and sort fine gravels and sediments. Now, salmon will spawn in gravels created by stable river systems, and then they spend their adult lives in the ocean, the Pacific Ocean. And when they return as adults in 3 to 5 years' time, they come loaded with these high isotopes of marine-derived nutrients, specifically nitrogen-15 and carbon-14. And then when they spawn and lay their eggs for the next generation, their carcasses are carried off into the forest by bears, martens, eagles, and other critters who eat them, dragging them deep into the forest where they decompose, or the bears will go deeper and defecate. And all of that is broken down by slugs and insects and all other critters, which returns that marine-derived nutrient, that nitrogen, to the forest, which allows those trees to grow and thrive into these massive, some of the biggest trees on Earth, that in turn create stable river systems that allow, salmon to have perfect habitat to spawn in. So it's this cycle that has evolved over hundreds and thousands of years. And there have been studies on 500 plus year old cedars where they've looked at the heartwood of these trees and found this marine derived nitrogen, this nitrogen 15 in their heartwood, suggesting this century long relationship between cedar trees and the salmon. And trees also form all sorts of complexities in their crowns, that form the ability for other species to take place there. So you have epiphytes, or mosses and lichens, things like we have here, which grow all over the trees, but there's a certain couple species of lichen that grow exclusively up in the canopies of these trees that fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, that when they break off and fall off on limbs or in windstorms, they drift down to the forest floor and they help recycle the nitrogen to that ecosystem to help fertilize it and keep it healthy. And these lichen only exist in the canopies of some of the biggest, oldest trees. They don't exist in second growth trees. Some of these branches here form really complex shelves and benches that house all sorts of epiphytes, yes, mats of moss, but also provide home to, seabirds like marbled murrelets, squirrels, birds, all sorts of things, different eagles that will grow and live exclusively kind of in these mats. And then you have, trees that basically become the home for other trees. And this photo here, you can see this is a big western red cedar with this candelabra crown. And this right here, the base here, this is a western hemlock right here that germinated up in the crown of this tree, and this single root follows all the way down to the trunk. This is about 80 meters up in the air, going down to get its nutrients from the soil. But this tree lives exclusively, it lives in the canopy of this western red cedar. And so all of this canopy complexity creates significant amount of carbon storage in these forests. Like, the wood contains a lot, but there's even more up in the canopies of these trees, just in all these layers of things growing and living on these trees. And then the trees themselves create all sorts of complex habitat. This tree on the left here shows some holes created by pileated woodpeckers. And when these trees die and become standing wildlife trees, these holes and cavities are burrowed out that other birds, mammals, and insects use to live and feed in. We have massive root cavities like this one here we can see, which become prime habitat for bears. And this is a type of complexity that's formed when you have a massive, let's say a 1,500-year-old western red cedar. It falls over in a windstorm, and then the next generation of trees kind of grow on top of that, using it as a nurse log. And then as that nurse log decays, it ends up leaving this standing cavity here that is, again, prime habitat for bears. But this type of complexity is something that takes basically 3,000 years of forest development to even form this one little feature. And something we take for granted. We don't recognize how long-lived these forests are and how much energy and work goes into creating these features. And then, of course, we have humans, cultural needs. Indigenous peoples have been using western red cedar in particular since time immemorial. The cedar here is referred to as the tree of life because they would pull strips of bark on it, like we can see here, and use this material for everything from housing to clothing to tools to smoking fish. It played a significant role in the cultures of the peoples who have lived on this coast since the beginning of people living on this coast. So forests, we tend to think of in our Western minds as kind of just like a collection of trees, but they are not just a collection of trees. Forests are a very interconnected ecosystem of various species all working together to thrive. And then within all of this above ground mass we have, there is the mycorrhizal fungi that exist in the soils underneath it, out of sight, out of mind, that will group different species of plants and shrubs and trees all together so that they can share nutrients and resources. And in the process, they feed insects, bacteria, archaea, nematodes, all living in the soil, and they keep these whole ecosystems thriving as a community. And this underground carbon storage is huge. In these temperate rainforests here in the Pacific Northwest, up to 70% of the carbon stored in these forest ecosystems actually exist underground. And when we cut down these trees, we lose that carbon store that exists in the soils. You know, we think of trees as being this massive carbon store, but they make up a relatively small portion of all the carbon in these ecosystems. When you extract a tree from a healthy old growth forest, that's really only about 10% of the carbon kind of in that little area. Like the max you can get is 10%. The other is lost through the leafy debris and material above ground that doesn't get processed. And then again, all the carbon stored underground. So really amazing, really unique ecosystems. And of course, one of the most amazing trees we have here, which I've already been talking about a lot, is the Western red cedar, or Thuya plicata. Now, this tree is incredible for many different reasons. It's part of the Cupressaceae family, which is one of the oldest families of trees to have evolved on Earth. This includes other trees like the giant sequoia, redwoods, sugi or Japanese cedar, as well as juniper trees. And they have a really fibrous bark that insulates and protects them from fire. And they also love really damp, humid, wet environments. So they tend to grow biggest on low floodplains and rivers in the area. Now, Cupressaceae, all the members of the Cupressaceae family, are known to have a very distinct aromatic scent. Anybody that works with wood kind of knows this scent. It's very characteristic of cedars. And this is created by a volatile oil in the bark and in the wood known as thuya. And this volatile oil, it wards off fungi, insects, disease, and allows these trees to live for an incredibly long periods of time, growing very slowly over long periods, makes them very resistant to rot, gives them very straight grain, and thus they're in very high demand for all sorts of things from outdoor furniture, use in siding on houses, to saunas, anything outdoors. It's all created because of this thuya in the wood. So when settlers, Western settlers, first came to this area back in the 1800s, we began to log these forests. That's, what we had taken the silviculture practices from Europe, brought it over here to North America. And this early logging occurred from the kind of late 1800s to the early 1900s. And for the most part, it wasn't that bad. It was selective logging based on the types of trees that could be pulled out. And it left forests pretty intact. You can see here we've got three fellows just outside of Seattle, Washington, working on they have their double-sided saws here, working to cut down this massive Western red cedar. And then over here we have a line of oxen pulling out a Doug fir on a skid row that's been created. But you can see they selected and just pulled out this Doug fir here and left these kind of massive cedars standing here. So we still had a lot of ecological complexity in these early days of logging. It was all hand sawed. They pulled the best trees out one by one and left these forests relatively intact. And these beginning days, spruce trees and fir trees were the biggest drivers. There wasn't much demand for cedar because it was often really warpy and curvy wood. They didn't have a good way to process it. There was lots of fiber. It was really difficult to mill. So that wasn't the things that they first demanded. But as technology evolved and developed, as it does, we enter this new era, kind of post-1950s, post-war mechanization of logging. So World War II wraps up and we have all this incredible tank technology that basically gets turned into extraction. So we begin harvesting much more volume, much more frequently. In the early days, cedar still isn't in demand. It's often just felled to get it out of the way to access other timbers. But in the 70s and 80s, demand begins to grow because of our ability to process it and turn it into shingles for housing, siding, all sorts of stuff. So you can see this photo here in the upper left. This is a photo from the 80s where we have this truck that is just stacked to the brim, tons of old growth Western red cedars trucked on it. Kind of wild to see a photo like that and imagine that happened, but that's what was going on. And initially it was easy to access lowlands were targeted first, big river valleys with the biggest and best trees growing. But as the supply in those low valleys dwindled, eventually logging operations moved upwards into the watersheds to the tip tops of these mountains, and it was very efficient. This is a map of kind of what we can see across the United States. There is, very little, virtually no old growth forest left in the United States, aside from what's what's already kind of protected in parks. This logging was very, very efficient. And this map we have over here is a map of British Columbia. So we have it organized by three colors. So you can see the red is all areas that have been cut or logged. The light green is primary forest, so old growth forest that is really low productivity. This is high alpine environments, bog areas where you have really small, scraggly growing trees. And then all the dark green that you can see here is the remaining high productivity old growth forest. So I would encourage any of you to take a look, maybe zoom in if you can. Do you see much dark green on this map? There is very, very little at all. In fact, here in British Columbia, high productivity forests are down to 2.7% of their historic range here in British Columbia, which represents less than 1% of all of the forests in British Columbia. And of what remains of that high productivity old growth forest, only about 50% are in protected areas, which is less than 0.5% of all the forests in BC. So anytime you see a tourism campaign ad, some sort of kind of greenwash slogan thing saying how sustainable old growth logging in BC is, those are usually from the protected areas that make up 0.5% of forests in British Columbia. And this type of logging creates some really, really big problems. So the demand for trees, specifically cedar, creates clear cuts like this, which is the most economically viable way of harvesting. It keeps costs very low and profits high, but it has big impacts. The biggest one to mention in a photo like this, and just for scale, you can see right where my cursor is, there's actually a human, just to put that into perspective here. It changes the hydrology of these landscapes. So these forests develop in really rich, damp, wet microclimates. And when they are cut down in mass like this, they dry out and they desertify. So the forests that follow this are never going to grow back to be the same ones that were existed there prior. It makes it much easier for trees like pines to come back that don't need as much water, but big Western red cedars aren't going to come back as easily. And when you log to the top of mountains like this and you create roadways, that leads to runoff. It changes the way that water flows down this mountain, which increases sedimentation and landslides. It means that materials and sediments flow down into streams and freshwater habitat below, which kills the fish. It kills their habitat. And without fish, you have no food for the animals or the humans that live in this area, and you have no nutrients that make their way back up to the forest. So the whole system collapses as a result of this type of management. And then you have the second growth forests that follow that. So second growth forests have quite a few different issues with them. The biggest one is that they have this single layered canopy. Because you have an even age stand of trees, whether that is regenerated naturally from the seed bank in the soil, or if it's planted, you have very little to no light reaching the understory. So nothing grows underneath these trees. There's no berries, no food for animals, no room for larger animals like deer, elk, or bears to even move through because of this densely packed forest. You have a lack of heterogeneity, which means that all these trees are the same age, the same species, the same spacing of trees. So there's no diversity, no resilience built into this ecosystem. So when diseases or pests like beetles or fungus come into these ecosystems, they can just go rampant and take over the whole forest, kind of like what we saw with the pine beetle here in North America, kind of through the late 90s through the early 2000s. In a mature, complex old growth forest, that complexity keeps fires and disease out. It keeps fires from being catastrophic because you have diversity of bigger, older trees, smaller, younger trees, spacing between them. You have all of this stuff so it doesn't just sweep through the forest like fires are kind of doing now. Additionally, you have all these ladder fuels that are created. If you can see all these really tiny sticks here on these trees, because these trees are so focused on competing with each other to grow up and fill this space, they don't shed their lower branches. And when fire comes through, whether it be natural or unnatural, which would normally burn the understory, instead of doing that in a kind of low intensity burn, it climbs those ladder fuels and burns in the canopy as a canopy fire, spreading hotter and burning much faster than fires would naturally in this forest ecosystem. This type of really tight second growth forest also increases stem flow and runoff from rain, which removes the topsoil, which keeps things from growing here, makes it more prone to droughts, which again increases fire risk. It increases erosion, the sedimentation of streams, and landslides. So this lack of diversity and complexity reduces carbon storage as well. Like nothing can function in this system as well as it can in an old growth forest because of the way that these trees are stunted. And it will take hundreds to thousands of years for this forest to mature and go through successional patterns naturally that allow it to become the type of old growth forest that we lost. This isn't something that we can just replace on 70-year cycles. And it creates some really lasting issues. So you have a lack of habitat. That 3,000-year-old bear den that I mentioned. You can't get that in a second growth forest that is on a 50 to 70-year rotation. So you lose habitat for these big charismatic megafauna that we're used to having around here. It changes these long-term ecological processes that create that type of habitat, whether it be in the root cavities or the standing dead trees, all sorts of different stuff. It creates landslides, like we can see here, which run all the way down the valley into the creeks here. And the sediment from these landslides will take hundreds of years to move through these rivers. And salmon populations are facing dire times, and they just don't have that kind of time. And then again, you have wildfire susceptibility, which causes landscape level changes because of what leaves behind. And combined with climate change, it's just happening so much more frequently and burning so much more hotter and faster than it would naturally. It's creating some really, really brutal issues. And then again, on top of all this, we have massive carbon loss. The carbon stored in canopies, in the woods themselves, and everything stored underground, because when these trees die, whether they're logged or whether they're burned up, it destroys that mycorrhizal fungi, and we lose all the carbon stored in the soil. And the worst part about all of this is that it's still happening today. This video of a tree being felled is from just a few months ago here in British Columbia. And this one here of that truck loaded with old growth cedar, that's from just about 2 years ago at the height of government in BC working to protect old growth forests. And so even with the best practices, the best estimates by scientists and people in the industry say that there is no more than a decade left of logging of this type of forest. So we're at the very bottom of the barrel here. And these companies are doing all that they can, to kind of keep the general public from knowing how bad things really are. And they're working really, really hard at misleading them, which is just a shame. So they do this through multiple different ways, primarily industry associations like this Forestry for the Future here, which is a subdivision of FPAC. So they heavily market the idea that Canadian forestry is the most sustainable in the world, but this is just lost in the nuance because that definition is subjective. It's only considered quote unquote sustainable from an economic perspective because you're still making money somehow, but it doesn't account for the ecological, the social, the cultural values or community damages that are all lost in this harvest method, which is not sustainable at all. So they purposefully leave out the nuance and manipulate their messaging to deceive people. These logging industry associations are made up of the CEOs of, like, their boards are the CEOs of some of these major logging companies who, at the same time, these major logging companies are actively lobbying the government, promoting this message to the public, and then trying to do all they can from a policy level to keep things from actually changing to maintain the status quo. Within the British Columbia government and industry, there are many different governmental ties. People bounce back and forth between roles in industry and in government, and they continue to work to water down and prevent regulations from impacting their business model. They also engage in a fair amount of greenwashing, again, claiming that logging is sustainable, but not accounting for the ecological, social, cultural, community damages. And they've created a whole kind of racket of certifications. Now, I have 4 certifications here listed. I'm calling out 3 of them for being terrible. Want to just start off the bat by saying FCS is the best that we have, and that FCS is great. But when you look at sustainable forest certifications, you have ones like SFI, PEFC, and CSA here that are all run by the industry. They have no accountability. Their boards are filled with CEOs of the biggest logging companies. They're performative measures. They set their own standards. They have no accountability. And if they fail to meet even the standards that they set, they don't lose their certificate. They have no ramifications for their actions. This clear cut here, where you can actively see that they clear cut to the top of this mountain, you have landslides that come down right into this river here. This is an SFI certified sustainable forest operation. There is no way that this is sustainable. They have no accountability to anybody but their shareholders. FSC, on the other hand, is the best. They have, third-party audits. They have performance-based standards, much more rigorous scrutiny, an ability for companies to lose their certifications if they fail to meet standards. Now, having said that, FCS does a really great job of operating in plantation style management. But in these types of old growth forest ecosystems, they still can't adequately capture the nuances of this style of harvest or take into account the interconnected factors based on all these different ecosystem types, whether we're out here on the coast of Cascadia, more in the interior of British Columbia. All these different ecosystems are radically different. And as good as FSC is, wood coming from British Columbia that has old growth grains in it is basically just there's no way to make it certifiably sustainable. And all of this is happening on public land, which is a much different model than a lot of other countries utilize. Not only is it public land, it's crown land, but it's stolen land, stolen from the indigenous peoples who have lived on these lands since time immemorial. And this logging occurs on their lands without informed prior consent from these indigenous nations, which is a violation of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declarations of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, something that Canada has committed to, but is actively kind of backpedaling on right now. And this plays out in many different ways. Many companies will engage with what's called indigewashing, where they will pay out an indigenous partner a small percentage of harvest that they use to promote their engagement, even though there's corruption that exists within these government. And often these nations are in such disenfranchised states as a result of rampant colonization and basically subjugation over the past 100 years, 150 years, that it's something that's referred to as consent by coercion, as Grand Chief Stuart Phillip has said, where they have no other option but to sign these in order to meet their basic needs. And it's just not an ethical way of doing this, because these companies aren't responsible for the externalities of harvest. They have no stake in the future forest health and biodiversity and carbon or in these communities. And the public, at least here in Canada and North America, in the Northwest here, are fed up with it. It led to the timber wars in the United States in the 90s, the war in the woods here in British Columbia, and most recently the Fairy Creek blockades, which these photos are from, which happened just in 2021, which to this day are the largest act of civil disobedience in all of Canadian history, with almost 1,200 arrests, people standing up, protesting, blockading, trying to keep the last of these old growth forests from being logged. So these old growth forests are incredibly important. And using old growth timbers, whether it's Western red cedar or any kind of timber, there's just no way that it can truly be sustainable. Despite managing any of the messaging you might hear, the manner in which it's harvested destroys these ecosystems irreparably that take thousands of years to mature. And once they're gone, they will likely never come back again because of forest degradation, biodiversity loss, and climate change. As a result of climate change, Western red cedar in particular isn't expected to be able to germinate and grow in this region in the next 50 years because of this changing climate. And when we, destroy these ecosystems, we make it that much harder for them to even continue to survive. So old growth Western red cedar is not sustainable. It's not ethical. It's not a moral choice to be using. We need to create healthy, intact forests for climate change mitigation, to sequester and store carbon, and old growth is the best way of doing that. So we need to preserve these old growth forests, but also work to increase the complexity of second growth forests to provide more ecological services and functions through restoration. Because this diversity creates resilience, and we need more of that in a changing climate, not just for biodiversity, for climate mitigation, for ecological function, but for our community health and safety. We need to live in communities that aren't threatened by wildfire or landslides or having their fresh water threatened. Like all these ecological functions that these forests serve, make our communities healthy and safe. So there are many other values to value a forest for beyond their economic drivers. They need to be preserved for cultural, ecological, spiritual, recreation values, not only for the forest directly, but the waterways, the marine ecosystems, all of the other aspects of these watersheds. So we need to find a way to support community, not corporations. Fortunately, there are a lot of great solutions out there. Wood is an amazing material, and it is totally possible to source it consistently in a less impactful manner, and we will always have a need for it. So how do we do it better? There are several options here, supporting community forest projects that take into account a wide range of stakeholder values, not just shareholder values, is amazing. Indigenous-led operations, there are quite a few of those kind of popping up. You can support products that come from FSC certified forests and value stakeholders with performance-based standards that have, third-party auditing from outside of the industry. And you can support innovative industries and small businesses that are doing the right thing. The forest and logging industry, like so many industries these days, is dominated by these big global conglomerates, these big players who use their scale and power to push the markets and maximize their profits. But we really need to do all we can to support the little people, the people who are working on the ground in their communities to make a difference and change the status quo. And there is a ton to explore in this space, with CLT, cross-laminated timbers, new growth timbers, alternatives from plantation forests, different methods of processing that create really long-lasting, high-performing alternatives to wood that comes from an old growth forest. And there's a lot you can do here, you know. Architecture and design can play a major, major role. Like any sort of design industry, it creates trends, it can make things cool, it can make things really unfavorable, and it can drive change by changing the demand for what people are wanting. And we can start using, you know, high quality wood products, using things differently, using value added products to create really unique, beautiful designs that support the people they house, as well as the communities and ecosystems that they come from. So by changing the demand for better wood, we can change the dynamics of the market to continue to grow while creating a better, healthier world. So just as I'm wrapping up here, I'd like to make a comparison just to leave you all with something to think about. African elephants are a keystone species in their ecosystems. You know, their grazing patterns maintain savannas, maintain plants, keep species of plants and trees in check. They impact the soils and what's able to grow and changes the hydrology of the area. So when, you know, rain does come, it floods and pools in certain areas. And they feed carnivores and are part of a whole interconnected bio-wide region nutrient cycle. And without them, the ecosystems that they live in collapse. But they are threatened with extinction. You know, just as the demand for elephant tusks for ivory has led to population collapses that threatens these ecosystems, the demand for Western red cedar and basically all old growth timbers threatens the collapse of these forest ecosystems. Just how like bans on ivory from elephant tusks never stopped piano makers from making pianos, right? We all still have pianos. It didn't kill the industry. It just forced piano makers to pivot and get creative with alternatives that were less impactful, less destructive, more ethical, and a better choice for the future of life on this planet. So I implore all of you to get creative, find alternatives, support people working to create change and do things differently, because these forests are incredibly important both regionally and globally for various cultural and ecological functions. And we need to find a way to do better collectively as humanity in this world amongst the changes that are occurring today. You know, we are all responsible, whether or not it's happening in our backyard. We need to make positive and impactful, informed decisions about what we do today to help ensure a better future. You know, humans always have been and always will be active parts of these ecosystems. And so it's up to us to change our relationship in a way that doesn't purely serve these myopic human needs, but can support all of those within the lands and waters that we all share for a more healthy, vibrant future of tomorrow. So thank you very much for hanging with me through that. I hope you all learned a lot. And let's pop over now to chat with Dan.
Hey guys. Hey, look, thank you so much for that, Ross. That was amazing. And I think you've got a really unique set of skills in combining your ecological knowledge along with your communication skills and filmmaking. It really makes for a great level of communication on the topic. Hey, Ross, I've got a couple of questions for you. Firstly, I love the analogy that you made with elephants, because it just seems crazy now that we're killing elephants to get ivory to do things. And then when you consider the same example here with old growth, I think that's just a really simple and easy way of considering what's happening with old growth in Canada and in other parts of the world. In terms of a couple of questions, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to make another analogy to like furs. You know, in the 90s, people had like mink coats, and you just had to make mink coats unfavorable, unpopular. And that's kind of what we need to be doing with old growth timbers right now. Like, we shouldn't be using this. We know better. We have the science, we have the data. We've been doing it for far too long, and we need to evolve and grow and be better. Yeah.
I think, at least from our experience, taking a negative view on old growth logging, it feels like we've, as global citizens, we've been banging. Some of us have been banging this drum for a while, including yourself. It feels like taking a negative view and saying stop old growth logging isn't really having success. And I think our approach is to start taking a view of positive activism. And if we talk about positive activism in the space, what does that mean for you?
Well, I think positive activism is really trying to find a way to unite people and bring people together. Like, this presentation I just gave is only just a quick 45 minutes of so much information, but like I come from a family with a logging history, and like so often in these really difficult conversations that we're having these days around all these issues, climate change, logging, wars, like international relations, like it's so easy to divide people and villainize people. And I feel like loggers especially often get the short end of the stick and are villainized, but they're just people trying to find a way to make a living and live like every one of us. It's not necessarily about pointing fingers and saying you're doing it wrong, you're bad, you're evil, because I don't think that's productive in any way. It's really about like, how do we shift the narrative and work to drive progress in a different direction and find solutions that actually can create employment, that can create healthy ecosystems, that can do a lot of really great work, in these forest ecosystems to preserve the ecological, cultural, biodiversity values, while also employing people and still getting to use wood. Like, it's not an either or situation, it's a both and. We just have to be more conscious about doing it better. And to me, that's kind of the idea behind positive activism, is like, how do we create change that works for everybody and not just making it just another one-sided divisive issue?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And when you think about a place like Canada, we understand, I think a lot of people understand that places in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Brazil, there's a whole lot of corruption and things. And you kind of understand how tropical deforestation happens. But in the case of Canada, we see that being a first world nation with a whole lot of complexity and knowledge. What policy settings exist in Canada today that allow these 1,000-year-old trees to get cut down? How does that even happen?
That is such a loaded, complex question and answer. I think it's important to recognize that Canada, and British Columbia in particular, was founded as a colonial extraction state, like for the British Empire. Within the founding documents of British Columbia, it is talking about bountiful waters and forests for use for the British military. So like, our founding is on this kind of extraction of resources mentality. And then there's all these sorts of different layers of nuance, kind of like a legal plurality that exists here, where you have the federal government, provincial government, and then you have the First Nations governments under them, which are just kind of now at this point in time beginning to be recognized. So where logging might be legal under one kind of framework of legality, it might not be done with consent for the nations on whose land those forests exist. When logging tenures are awarded to private companies to log certain areas of forest, of crown land in a given time frame, that's often done through the ministry without necessarily consent for the nations on whose land that is. And then that has to be a whole separate process. So there's all sorts of like layers of ethical and kind of, ethical ways of going about this pretty like muddy red tape area. And a lot of these bigger kind of stubborn, more colonially established companies like the Big Five in the province just use their power and might to kind of continue to bulldoze through whatever they can in order to make the maximum amount of return for their shareholders. Because that's, in any sort of privatized company, that's what takes precedence, is they're trying to maximize returns to the people who are invested in them. And if they don't do that, then they lose money, then they get shut down. And it's just kind of this catch-22 where that's what they have to do to exist, versus supporting these smaller kind of community forest operations, the locally managed forests that are done by the community for the community, who are managing for their own well-being and paying attention to, well, hey, if I clear cut this hillside above our town, that's going to potentially create landslides that come into our town and destroy our town. So maybe we don't do that. Whereas the bigger companies don't think like that. So there's all sorts of competing factors and competing priorities based on these different levels of kind of this legal plurality that I mentioned, and where companies sit and operate within that. But it's still commonplace. I think the way that industry around here has specifically been able to market it as a sustainable thing is just by leaving the definition of sustainable very, very big and lacking any nuance. So they're not looking at the sustainable metrics of their harvest from an ecological perspective. They're not looking at leaving cultural trees for the nations to use, for these nations to build canoes in 1,000 years. Like, that's not going to happen if you cut down all these trees now. Like, they need much older, bigger trees to do that. And it's not just about the size of the tree, it's the quality of the wood. And if you're taking the best and leaving the scraggly stuff for the nation, it's like, that's not ethical. So right now, like, economics are kind of the primary driver behind all forest management. And that needs to change. We need to create a system, and there's been talk about it in British Columbia for years now, but a system of recognizing biodiversity and ecological values within our forest management, and just kind of changing the paradigm that we think about this stuff. And things like Fairy Creek have been really good at raising that awareness and getting people to talk about that, and kind of lighting a fire under government agencies to start to create a new structure for how we manage these forests. But unfortunately, in the last 6 months, with everything happening in the United States and the threats of tariffs and becoming the 51st state, priorities have shifted, and they've kind of abandoned that right now. And it's really been a weak point that industry is taking advantage of. And they're like literally going to forest areas where they have tenures and just cutting everything down with plans to pull the wood out in like maybe 5-10 years time, after regulations go through that make it harder to cut those trees down. So they're just trying to get them on the ground now, with the understanding that like it's gonna happen soon. They're not gonna be able to cut it. So they're just taking advantage of it. And yeah, it's really sad to see when there's so little left.
Yeah, that seems unfortunate. It's probably the appropriate word I can come up with. And so what does the future look like for Canada? Because I think what you're saying, and I think most people that have listened to your presentation will agree, that the remaining 2% of old growth, or 2.3% of old growth cedar and species that exist in BC, they really need to be left alone and at least maintained. And then you've got a plantation rotation that you've got sitting in BC at the moment that you pointed out doesn't have the ecological benefits of old growth. What does the future for wood look like in Canada in your mind?
Oh, I mean, it's really difficult. These are just such big, complex issues. There's currently a lot of demand, like, as bad as it is to be down to the last, it's 2.7% of that type of ecosystem. So the biggest and best trees that ever existed, it's 2.7%. So it's really just like a slim margin. Again, less than 1% of all the trees in British Columbia are those kind of big, ancient, amazing trees. And as the threat of that has come into reality, there have been like a lot of really inspiring examples of kind of small woodlot operations and different community forests that have popped up that are working in a different way of management known as kind of ecoforestry. The best way I could talk about this is it's kind of like the idea of what's that? It's like you have traditional agriculture, and then you have the word is on the tip of my tongue.
Okay, I think I know where you're going with
sustainable
this,
agriculture,
yeah. Like a permaculture type mentality.
Permaculture. Thank you. Yeah, it's basically like the permaculture of forest management, where you're now managing a second growth forest, and a lot can be done to restore those second growth forests. You know, I talked about all the negative impacts that they have. It's relatively easy to go through and do like an ecological thin through those forests. And within 10-15 years, the ecosystem rebounds and you have all that diversity. You have better water storage and carbon storage just showing up naturally. But that costs money, and you're not necessarily extracting something to profit off of in doing that. So you really need to shift the model back to communities, back to smaller management, smaller woodlots that are able to manage these ecosystems in the long term, where they can make that sort of investment knowing that they're not going to see the rewards for, 200, 300 years from now, which is the type of long-term thinking that like a lot of the indigenous communities have had in forest stewardship and management since the beginning of time. It just doesn't really fit into our kind of, more colonial capitalist model of thinking, where you're looking at fourth quarter returns and trying to map things out on 5-year terms. This is looking much more long-term, because there is a lot we can do. It just, we have to find ways to incentivize managing for different styles, managing for different values. And there's a lot of that happening right now. But I think more needs to be done in terms of like consumers demanding more of that from their wood products as well.
I think that's the community forest thing's a nice idea, and it's definitely a place for it. If I put my industry hat on, I would say that that's got no potential to scale to meet the needs of people and the growing population and the needs for more homes. And I feel like, at least from a New Zealand perspective, that we've come up with a sort of middle ground where we've retained our old growth forest here in New Zealand. It's around 20-25% of our land mass is now retained and native, in the same way that the Europeans arrived in New Zealand, and the settlers of New Zealand in general came in and harvested a whole lot of our native timber. And in the 60s and 70s, we stopped doing that. We've got 25% roughly in native that's left untouched, and then we've developed this rapidly renewable plantation estate that is basically meeting the needs of our wood requirements and the needs of other countries, because we export more than half of it. And so, from an Abodo perspective, one of the possible solutions that we've started working down is how can plantation forests also enable permanent native. And taking a leaf out of your book and pointing it at FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, being a minimum hygiene factor, and how we can mosaic and permanent native stands around plantation stands and maintain at least a level of biodiversity while getting the wood fiber that we need. And I don't think that is a perfect model, but that's sort of how we pitch this new growth concept at Abodo, and actively work with foresters that aren't just focused on the bottom line, like you said, but also do care about the ecosystem benefits of the forest and are prepared to weave some permanent biodiversity benefits into the forest while maintaining a production forest at the same time. I guess it's a bit like having a lettuce farm, having some lettuces over here, but then you've got some native forest over here that provides a mosaic of solution in the land. I don't think that's perfect, but that's one of the things that we're trying to champion here at Abodo. What's your view on that sort of concept?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great. Again, I think it's really important to galvanize behind and support people who are doing things differently. Like, at the end of the day, anybody doing anything differently for even the littlest bit better is progress, And I think there's a lot to be said about, you talk about giving these forest managers something to value for other than economics. And like, the reality is anybody who gets into forestry work, they don't do it because they hate trees and they want to cut them down. It's the companies who want the profits. Like, they want to manage for healthy forests. So if you're giving people an opportunity to work in the woods and do so in a constructive way that creates healthy ecosystems, I think that's a huge win. And especially operating within the kind of mosaics of those protected forests, there's a lot to be said about creating biodiversity corridors, like habitat corridors for different species to move through and about. And then there's a lot to be said about even then changing the way that you harvest, so that when you do harvest, it's not just like you're clearing those forests again and again on kind of this blanket model, but looking at selectively pulling out trees. And you can still have like an area that is dedicated to harvest, but as long as you're maintaining that kind of closed canopy structure and like pulling forests out of there, pretty soon you're not gonna be killing the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil every time you harvest and rotate your crop. You're gonna continue to build that up. You're gonna have more growing in the understory, and that's gonna become a much bigger carbon sink than if you were to just be cutting it like you would just like a normal crop in traditional agroforestry. So I think there's a lot to be said. Like, it's a great model. I think there's still like improvements to be made, but it's all about just thinking about things differently. And I think that is like a really admirable thing to do. And I've looked into what Abodo has done and is doing, and know that there's where we are now, and there's like goals to where things could be. But like, we have to, walk up this ladder one rung at a time. And I think it's important to help people along that first step, and companies that are starting to do good, so that we can get to a place in like a decade or 2 decades time where we have healthy mosaic of complex, mature forests that is managed for human needs, while also serving ecological needs for the other, plants and animals and non-human people that we share these lands with, while also protecting communities, providing, clean water, not threatening them with wildfires and landslides, and also storing carbon in an era of climate change. Forests are one of the best tools we have to sequester and store mass amounts of carbon, but they have to be managed as complex forests in order to do so effectively. and it's just one stepping stone to getting there. And to your point, the community forests at the beginning, like when you mentioned, like, I talked to quite a few people about this, especially in the forestry industry, but if you crunch the numbers, when you look at the scale that BC in particular, like, exports and puts out as far as what's harvested, it's just changing that. So you wouldn't actually be taking or reducing the amount of wood being pulled from the forest. You'd be doing it across a wider region, just like with a fine comb, pulling things out, so like maintaining that forest cover, that closed canopy system, and then just selecting the wood based on what the forest is able to regenerate in the given harvest period. You wouldn't change the amount of wood being being exported, being used. You just change how you're getting it, is kind of the main thing. And there's a really great example of a community forest here on Vancouver Island, where it was an old growth Douglas fir forest, and it's been managed for timber values along with ecological values for almost 80 years now. And they've actually made more money and been able to create more wood in those 80 years through selectively harvesting and pulling out no more from the forest than the forest can regenerate and grow in the given 5-year harvest time, because they go through on very short selective cycles, than had they just clear cut it at the beginning. So if they had clear cut it at the beginning and cashed out and gotten all that money, they would have made less money than actively managing it over that 80-year period and still getting the same amount of wood, making more money with an intact ecosystem. Like, it's totally possible. We just need to change the way that we think about management.
That's right. And the trip that I made to Vancouver Island a couple of years ago now, I noticed that there's a certain amount of tourism value from standing old growth forests too that can be used as another alternative to monetize old growth forests rather than just harvesting them. But so there's other options as well for landowners. And I guess one of the questions I've got here is that we've got people on the call from around the world, builders, architects, designers. I think it's clear from your presentation that there's probably not enough transparency for these people to make decisions. How if you're a designer or a builder or an architect, how would you gather information to bridge the gap here in the knowledge gap that clearly exists?
Yeah, that's really difficult to say. I mean, it is unfortunate. The certification processes, like FSC, is the best, and I think always going with that is just like the easy, low-hanging fruit. But unfortunately, like, it does take digging and information. Like, there is no easy public-facing service that shows this as being the best. That's something that I would like to work on, is kind of like working to identify areas or community forests to support. But I think it comes down to, if you have the time and capacity, looking at where you're sourcing your wood from, like, look into where you're getting it from, supporting community forests, supporting Indigenous-led operations. I didn't mention it in my presentation, and I guess it kind of varies depending on where in the world that you are. But at least here in British Columbia, there is a huge market of reclaimed timbers, from like all these buildings that were built with an incredible old growth at the turn of the century that are being torn down to be built into skyscrapers. They're taking all these boards out, deconstructing it, and then you can purchase these boards and use them as timbers in new homes. And it's basically just like recycling and coming up with new ways to, again, do things differently and think about it differently. So it does, like, there is no easy way for people to just be able to go through a checklist and say, like, oh, this is the best wood, buy it, easy. Unfortunately, that sucks. I wish that there was a better and easier way to do that. Hopefully we're getting there. But again, if you have the capacity, and I mean, especially if you're like an architect or designer working with some kind of high-end firm or a really swanky multi-million-dollar homeowner who wants to go above and beyond, surely there's a way you can convince them to, like, the idea of having reclaimed timbers, like old barnwood that's been like remilled and planed and is smooth again, like, that has character and story that I think a lot of people who are currently purchasing old growth timbers would love to support if you just sell the story differently. And I think, yeah, it's just a lot about community and communications, getting people to understand that there's a different way of doing things. We don't all have to be keeping up with the Joneses in the same way,
Yeah, I agree with that. And it does my head in sometimes when we see these architectural awards here in New Zealand and Australia, where the winning winning amazing multi-million-dollar houses fully clad in old growth Western red cedar. And I guess, and I'm pretty sure that the decisions made by the designers and the homeowners wouldn't be fully informed. And if they'd perhaps seen your beautiful presentation, they might be a little more informed on those decisions. So I totally agree. And so, hey, look, you're really big on Instagram, so it's nerdy about nature, if I've got that right, on Instagram. And then you did this post, and I was reading some of the comments behind it. And one of the comments below it was something like, hey, look, this plantation wood is great, but we actually need the old growth timber because the old growth is the good stuff, and that's the durable stuff and everything else. And I feel like that it seems to resonate with a lot of people in the industry, particularly people that have been in the industry for a while, because they know the old trees are the good ones. And when I saw that, I thought, you know what, I'm going to respond to that. So I've got a little response that I've prepared on that, because here at Abodo, we use rapidly renewable timbers. That was someone that commented I haven't commented on Instagram. I should have.
You need to give your response.
Yeah, I didn't respond, but I just wanted to share this with people that are listening, because we're using rapidly renewable plantation trees, and these trees are sort of, I don't know, they're being harvested, say 27, 30 years. They're farmed under FSC. We're working with foresters that leaving a certain amount of the area set aside for permanent native and restoration projects. And just because this wood is coming from fast-growing trees doesn't mean that it's less durable than an old growth Western red cedar tree from BC that's 500 years old plus. And here in New Zealand, we import around $100 million of old growth Western red cedar from Canada, most of which is old growth. But we did some testing just to prove how durable our material was versus these old growth species. And I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to go a bit off piste here and share my screen. And so we did a little study on this, and we took some old growth Western red cedar and some of our thermally modified radiata pine, Abodo branded material, back in 2017, and we exposed them on these durability racks. And each of these racks have a horizontal untreated pine bearer, and that bearer rots and passes decay to the test samples, which are the small sticks you see sitting on top of that. And we did that for 7 3/4 years. And what we actually found was that all of the products decayed ever so slightly, and that's normal, that's expected, because we've created an environment where there's accelerated decay. But by the end of the test, the Abodo thermally modified radiata was in way better condition than the old growth Western red cedar. In fact, the Western red cedar has started to decay pretty badly towards the end of the test. And so there was about, I would say, 30 to 40% better performance from our thermally modified, rapidly renewable new growth timber versus the old growth timber. Dan. So we don't have to necessarily use old growth timbers to get where we need to get, just to make your point. Sometimes we can do things differently and get, in some cases, a better result.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's incredible. And just to speak on that a little bit more, this is the type of innovation that I'm talking about that needs to be supported. For so long, the industry has just done the status quo because it's been the easiest, because the model's established, and they know that, if I clear cut X amount of hectares of forest and I export this much, I can make this much return and pay out this much to my shareholders. And there's no incentive to do things differently. But if you start looking at we're putting satellites into space, and we're doing so many crazy things as a species, surely we can find ways to make radiata pine a little bit more durable, which we obviously have. It's just getting people to be informed about that and changing the narrative. And I think a lot of this idea about old growth being better timbers kind of comes from an older, kind of outdated mode of thinking. Okay, if you're saying that you want old growth because it's longer lasting and it's stronger, right? Well, what are you using it for? Most often in these cases, it's used as a veneer. So you're just plastering the outside of whatever you're building with a tight grain that could be from anything. And then where you really want the strength is in maybe some big timbers if you're doing a timber build. But then you have alternatives like cross-laminated timbers from second growth trees, which are structurally much stronger than old growth And again, it has kind of a cool design. It's a cool story. It's not an old growth tree. And like, why do you need to have old growth wood if you're just doing like a veneer on the front of a countertop? Like, that's just unnecessary. And it has nothing to do with being stronger, rot resistant, longer lasting. Like, it's literally something pretty to look at. You can do something different, you know? It's, again, just changing the way that we think about things. And I feel like for humans, that's a really difficult thing to do, but it starts, you know, one person at a time, just having conversations.
Yeah, well, that's the challenge. Ross has laid down the challenge for those that are in the design and build community. Think differently, and let's use materials a little more wisely. Hey, that's the questions, all the questions that I've got here, Ross. Thank you so much for this presentation. I love it. I love the graphics and all the intel that you wrapped up so beautifully in your presentation. Yeah, so thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been great chatting with everybody here. Thanks for everyone who tuned in and joined. And yeah, I'm really happy to be a part of the change. So thank you all for being here.
Thanks. Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you all for being part of this change. Yeah, it's been a wonderful experience, an amazing learning experience. I don't know about you, but my cognitive and emotional kind of connections firing after that presentation and conversation. So I'm going to wrap this up. Don't run away too quickly. I just want to give you some details about what's going to happen next. You're going to obviously get that email that's going to come through with the accreditation details. Following up from that, you'll have some more details about future learning experiences, about a webinar series which are going to continue and give you wonderful opportunities to stretch your cognitive legs like we've done today. Big thanks to Harley in the background, Jay looking after you in the chat. Again, you can hit her up with the details we've already shared. Thanks for your attention. I'm going to obviously look around and just double check I've got all that information I want to send you. Definitely. So big thank you to Ross Reid for that amazing presentation from Nerdy About Nature. Check out his details. I know that's going to be shared in the links and also in the chat and the follow-up emails. Big thanks to Daniel Gudsell as well for moderating and asking all the best questions, stuff that I usually do, but he does much better, definitely, in terms of his experience. And thanks again for your attention today. We'll see you at the next event that's coming up not too soon, not too far away now. Keep an eye on those emails for the details of that. Keep safe, keep in touch with each other, and we'll speak to you and see you very soon. Take care.